He came in every night with nothing but a worn backpack and silence so heavy it echoed louder than words. No one knew his name. No one asked. He never checked out a book, never made a sound, just sat beneath a single reading lamp like it was the only warmth he had left in the world. But when the librarian followed a hunch and looked behind the shelves, what she found would change everything. This isn't just a story about a boy. It's about what happens when someone finally notices and chooses to stay. The boy came in every night just after 6, always alone, always quiet, and always carrying that same worn-out backpack slung low over one shoulder. The library wasn't particularly busy during those hours. Most of the after-school crowd had cleared out, and the evening rush hadn't started. Still, he never missed a day, rain or shine, holidays included. Even when the heating had gone out for 2 nights in early December, he was there, sitting by the same third-row table near the back, under the soft yellow glow of the reading lamp, as if that corner was the only place in the world that ever made sense. He couldn't have been older than 13, maybe 14 on a stretch, but his eyes didn't match his age. There was a heaviness there, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from shyness, but from learning too early that silence can be safer than questions. His name, as the librarian would later learn, was Nathaniel James Miller. But for weeks, he was just the kid with the backpack. He never asked for help. He never made noise. He didn't even check out books. He'd sit at the same spot, unzip the old fraying pack, and pull out a battered composition notebook with a rubber band around it, a couple of pencils worn down nearly to stubs, and a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Sometimes he'd bring a library book to his desk, always returning it to the exact same place when he was done. But he never took any home. He never brought a phone. He never made a call. Every single evening he'd stay until closing, quietly gathering his things, only when the overhead announcement echoed through the library's calm. It wasn't until the 3rd week that Helen, the senior night librarian, began to really take notice. Not in the way staff notice regulars, but in the way a mother notices when something doesn't quite add up. The way his jeans were always the same pair, worn at the knees. The way his hoodie sleeves were too short, revealing thin wrists and bruises that didn't look like the kind from falling off a bike. The way he always seemed hungry but never asked for food. She started leaving granola bars in the free bookmark tray near the returns desk. By coincidence, they were gone every night by 8:30. She never said anything. Neither did he. But sometimes when she glanced up from her cataloging, she caught him giving the smallest nod in her direction. That was their entire conversation for nearly a month, the silent ritual of a boy surviving in the margins and a woman who remembered too well what it meant to be invisible. One evening in early January, as sleet fell in sideways sheets outside and the library's heating finally sputtered back to life, Helen noticed he wasn't just reading anymore. He was copying. He had a reference book open, an old one on U.S. history, and was furiously scribbling in his notebook with those tiny pencil nubs. His handwriting was cramped but neat, and he was mouthing the words as he wrote, like he was reciting them to make them stick. He worked for hours like that, breaking only once to unwrap half a sandwich, clearly saved from earlier in the day. It was instinct that made her approach him that night, not policy, not procedure, just that quiet tug in the gut that something isn't right. "Hey," she said softly, careful not to startle him. "You okay there?" He looked up, eyes wide, like he'd forgotten anyone else existed. Then he nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Just studying," he said. His voice was raspier than expected, like he didn't use it much. "Test tomorrow." She nodded slowly. "Big test?" He hesitated, then, "Yeah, big one." Helen smiled gently. "Well, good luck. We're closing in 15. I know, I'll be out." She turned to leave, but something stopped her. She looked back. "You always come here alone?" His eyes flicked up again, warier now. He nodded. "Parents working late?" she asked, not unkindly. A pause, then another nod. That night, after he left, still polite, still quiet, she walked over to the table. The reading lamp was still on, the chair slightly askew. She half expected to find a forgotten pencil or a crumpled note. But there was nothing, just that cold echo of absence that lingered when a space had meant something for someone, even if no one else understood why. Then she saw the spot near the far corner behind the tall biography shelves, a gap in the rows of books, just enough space for someone small to slip through. She rounded the shelves slowly and found it, a nest almost, a rolled-up hoodie acting as a pillow, a plastic grocery bag with an extra pair of socks, a crushed water bottle, and tucked carefully behind the stack, out of sight, a half-folded sleeping bag. Her chest tightened. It wasn't just that he was staying late, he was living here. She didn't call security. She didn't alert the city staff. She just stood there, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing in her ears, and the realization washing over her like ice. Someone had brought their world into this building not for shelter alone, but for safety, for warmth, for the kind of peace that didn't exist outside these doors. That night, after locking up, Helen sat at the staff desk long after everyone else had gone. She stared at the surveillance feed of the third-row table and the small figure who had once again carried the weight of the world in a backpack stitched with fraying thread. Then she picked up the phone. "Marvin," she said when the call connected, "I need a favor." The man on the other end sighed. "Helen, it's almost midnight." "What kind of favor?" "The kind you don't ask questions about." He was quiet a beat. "You okay?" "I don't know, but I think someone else isn't, and I can't let that go." "Where?" "Third and Hawthorne. City Library." The next night, Nathaniel came back, just like always. Only this time he paused near the return desk. There was a bag, paper, not plastic, with his name in tidy print. Inside, a pair of wool socks, 2 notebooks, 3 pencils, and a small handwritten note. "Keep writing. Someone's listening." He didn't say anything, just slipped the bag into his backpack and walked to his table. Helen watched from across the room, heart thudding as she saw him sit and take out the old composition book again. The spine was nearly shot, pages threatening to fall. But he kept writing. Hours passed. Near closing, just as the announcement came over the intercom, he stood to leave. Only this time, he walked to her desk. "Thank you," he said softly. Helen looked up, caught off guard. "For what?" He looked like he wanted to say more, then shook his head. "Just for not making me leave." She nodded. "You've got someone you can go home to, Nathaniel?" A pause, then, "Not tonight." "You ever need to talk?" "I can't," he said quickly. Not yet." And then he left, disappearing once again into the night. Helen didn't sleep well that night. She lay awake, thinking about the boy with 2 thin shoulders and eyes that had seen too much, about the sleeping bag behind the shelves, about the sandwiches and notebooks and things no child should carry alone. But she also thought about the way he had said thank you, and how sometimes the smallest words could carry the greatest weight. The next morning, she called Marvin again. "I need to know if there is a Nathaniel Miller registered at any school in the area." "Already checked," he replied. "There's one. Grade 8. Enrolled. But no current address on file. Transferred twice last year." Helen's voice dropped. "And? Looks like he stopped attending last month. Teachers marked him absent. No follow-up." She hung up without replying. Over the next week she watched him more closely. Every night, same routine. But now she noticed the limping gait when he thought no one was watching, the way he winced when he shifted too quickly, and most of all, the way he looked at the exit doors like they led back into a place he wasn't ready to face. Then came the night it all changed. Helen will never forget it. The storm outside had knocked out power in half the neighborhood. Most of the patrons had cleared out before dusk. The backup generators kicked on, flooding the library in that eerie amber glow. And still, at 6:04 p.m., Nathaniel walked through the doors, soaked to the bone, shoes sloshing, a fresh bruise just under his eye. She stood, heart racing. "Nathaniel!" But he didn't stop. He walked past her, straight to the third-row table, and sat. He pulled out the composition notebook with fingers that trembled. And then he just sat there, still, silent. Helen walked over slowly, crouched down beside him. "Did someone hurt you?" His head didn't move, but a tear slid down his cheek. She didn't ask again, just gently placed a hand over his. And for the first time, he let someone see him cry. Helen didn't ask questions the next day. She didn't need to. Nathaniel's silence spoke volumes, louder than any explanation ever could. But she noticed the small changes, the slower walk, the deeper hunch of his shoulders, the faint hesitation each time he reached into his backpack. It was as if even the weight of that bag had grown heavier, though she suspected it wasn't the fabric or the contents that burdened him. It was whatever he was carrying inside, the part no one could see. That evening, she waited until he settled at his usual spot. Then she crossed the room, holding a book. Not a library book, but a copy from her own collection, crisp, clean, the dust jacket barely wrinkled. She set it down beside him. "It's about kids who ran away," she said gently, not looking directly at him. "One of them ends up in a museum. You might like it." He blinked at the cover, unsure. "I don't like stealing." She gave a soft chuckle. "It's not stealing. It's borrowing. No due date." Still, he hesitated. His hand hovered above the book, then slowly drew back. "Thank you," he whispered, so quietly it was barely audible. Helen nodded and walked away. She didn't turn around, but if she had, she would have seen him touch the book's spine with careful fingers, like it might disappear if he wasn't gentle enough. For 3 more weeks the pattern held. Nathaniel came every night, ate half a sandwich, wrote furiously in his notebook. Sometimes he copied from history books, sometimes from old literature anthologies. Once, Helen spotted a Shakespeare play opened before him, Julius Caesar, its spine barely holding together, and watched in awe as he jotted lines into his notebook with the same focus of a student preparing for finals, not a boy without a school. The quiet watching turned into careful care. A scarf left near the coat rack on especially cold days. An extra sandwich in the staff fridge marked free. Even the janitor, Mr. Russo, began to sweep a little slower near Nathaniel's table, nodding to him without a word. But one night, Nathaniel didn't show up. At first, Helen thought she might have missed him. Maybe he'd come earlier or found a different spot to work. But by closing time, the table remained untouched. The book she'd given him was gone, which was something, but his absence left a hollowness in the air, like a piece of furniture removed from a familiar room. Then he missed the next day, and the next. On the 4th day, Helen did something she hadn't done in years. She took her break early, bundled herself in a coat, and walked the neighborhoods nearby. She didn't know what she was looking for exactly. A boy with a backpack, a corner store that might have seen him, a shelter worker who might know his name. But no one had, not at the school, not at the soup kitchen, 3 blocks down, not even the officer she flagged near the bus stop. "I don't know what else to do," she told Marvin later that night over the phone. "He was just here, and now he's not, like a ghost." Marvin's voice was low, measured. "You think something happened to him?" "I think something already did. I just don't know if it happened this week or years ago." 2 more days passed. On the 7th night, Helen was shelving books when she heard the front doors open. Not the usual creak of casual foot traffic, but that particular quiet, deliberate sound she'd come to recognize. She turned, and there he was, soaked again, hoodie sleeves tugged over his hands, the backpack still hanging from one shoulder. He looked thinner, paler, like he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. "Nathaniel," she breathed, rushing over. He winced, not from her tone, but from the effort of standing. "Where have you been?" His mouth opened, then closed. Finally, "Didn't have anywhere else." She didn't ask more. She just nodded and gestured toward his table. As he sat down, she noticed something strange. He didn't reach for his notebook. He didn't unpack at all. Instead, he rested his head on his arms and closed his eyes. "Nathaniel?" "Just tired," he mumbled. "I'll be out by closing, I promise." Helen paused, then walked to her desk and unlocked a drawer. She pulled out a blanket, small and fleece-lined, folded neatly for emergencies. She brought it to him without a word and draped it over his shoulders. He didn't thank her this time, but he didn't resist either. He slept until closing. That night, Helen didn't wake him. She simply dimmed the lights near his corner and kept working until 11:15, pretending there was still more to catalog, still more to shelve. She made a few calls, discreet ones, reached out to Marvin again, then a friend who worked in social services. There were laws, of course, policies about harboring minors, about reporting, but Helen had lived long enough to know that sometimes rules built to protect systems ended up failing the people they were meant to serve. When she finally nudged him awake, he blinked up at her in confusion. "Is it morning?" "Almost," she lied. "But I think we both need some rest." She gave him an address, a small community center with beds. Quiet. Safe. No questions. He took it without argument, but as he walked out into the cold, Helen felt the same dread in her gut. She wasn't sure he'd go, and if he didn't, he was gone for 3 more days. On the 4th, she found the book she'd given him, the one about runaways, slipped quietly onto the return cart. Tucked inside was a note. It was good. "Thank you," I went. "It's better now." Then, 2 weeks later, a woman appeared at the library's front desk, late 30s, neatly dressed but nervous. "I'm looking for someone who works here," she said. "I was told to ask for Helen." Helen stepped forward, cautious. "I'm Nathaniel's caseworker," the woman said, offering a card. "He told us this is where he felt safe." Helen didn't reply at first. She only nodded. "He wanted me to tell you thank you, and that he's staying. Permanently, I mean. He's been placed." Helen sat down slowly, overwhelmed. "He also said," the woman continued, digging into her bag, "that you should have this." It was the composition notebook, the original, fraying at the spine, filled with pages upon pages of Nathaniel's tiny, neat handwriting. "You said someone was listening. This is what I wanted them to hear." Helen turned the pages with trembling hands. There were stories in it, dozens, about loss and quiet hope, and kids who slipped between cracks but built ladders from words. Each one carried the same dedication. "For the lady at the library who saw me before I saw myself." And when she looked up, there were tears on her cheeks she hadn't noticed falling. That night, Helen placed the notebook in the front display case, just beside the checkout counter. She wrote a small card to go with it. "Words are not wasted when they give someone back their voice. Anonymous author." And every night after that, she kept watching the front doors. Not out of fear, not even out of habit, but because once a boy walked in carrying nothing but silence. And he left carrying stories the world was finally ready to hear. Weeks passed, and Nathaniel did not return to the library in the way he used to. Not as a boy hunched under the weight of a backpack and unseen burdens, but now, on the rare evenings he came, he entered like someone learning how to move freely again. He no longer drifted toward the third-row table out of habit or hiding. He walked like the room belonged to him now, like the silence was something he carried inside but was no longer suffocating under. Helen noticed everything: the cleaner clothes, the shoes that fit, the new backpack, brighter and more structured. But more than that, she noticed his eyes. They were still deep-set and a little too wise for someone his age, but the flicker of fear had dimmed. In its place was something cautious, but steadier. A boy testing his footing on ground that no longer crumbled beneath him. One night, just before the library closed, he lingered at the front desk. Helen was logging the last of the day's returns when she felt his presence before she even looked up. "I think I want to write a book," he said. She blinked, then smiled. "Yeah?" He nodded, more to himself than to her, about what it felt like, about before. She nodded gently. "That's a story worth telling." He shifted his weight. "Do you think people would want to read it?" Helen leaned forward. "I think there are people out there right now waiting to know they're not alone. They're waiting for your words, Nathaniel. They just don't know it yet." His eyes dropped to the floor, and when he looked up again, they were wet. Not in a way that needed to be apologized for, but in the way a dam leaks after holding back too much for too long. "Can I leave it here when it's done?" She reached for the small drawer at the side of the desk and opened it. Inside was the same velvet case that had once held her own journal from years ago, back when she thought her words would change the world. She slid it toward him. "Leave it, or don't. But this space, it'll always be yours." Nathaniel took the case like it was something sacred. After that, his visits became less frequent but more intentional. He didn't sit for hours copying textbooks or scribbling until his fingers cramped. He sat to write, to revise, to ask questions. Sometimes Helen would find him near the biographies, thumbing through the lives of people long gone as if searching for reflections of himself. Other times he'd ask about publishing, about ISBNs and copyright, and how to make sure someone's voice could travel further than the walls that tried to contain it. And then one evening, he didn't come alone. Helen looked up from the check-in kiosk to see him standing beside a woman in her late 30s, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big and holding the nervous air of someone visiting a place they'd only ever heard about. Nathaniel had his hand on her arm. "This is Ms. Helen," he said, and the way he said it, firm, proud, made her pause. The woman nodded quickly, like she'd practiced the moment in her head. "I'm his mom," she said softly. "Well, I'm trying to be again." Helen's breath caught in her throat. Nathaniel continued, his voice steadier now. "She's been clean for 7 months." His mother looked down. "I didn't know he was going to places like this," she murmured. I was afraid he was—" She stopped, unsure how to complete the sentence. Helen smiled gently. "He found his way here." The woman nodded slowly, a flicker of shame crossing her face, followed by something else, hope. "We're doing classes together," Nathaniel said. "GED for her, college prep for me." Helen's throat tightened. "I wanted you to know," he added, "because you were the first person who did." She blinked hard, then reached for the tissue box beneath the desk. "That means more than you'll ever know," he grinned. "You still have my notebook?" She chuckled, wiping her eyes. "I dust it every Tuesday." Nathaniel stepped forward then, pulling something from his new backpack, a book, real and bound, its cover a soft matte black with silver lettering that shimmered under the library lights. "Between Shelves and Silence" by Nathaniel J. Miller. He handed it to her like a gift. No ceremony, no announcement. "I published it," he said. Helen opened the cover to the first page. Inside, scrawled in careful print, was a dedication. "To the librarian who saw me, who gave me light when all I knew was quiet. You saved a life, maybe more than one." Helen hugged the book to her chest, eyes too full to speak. That night, long after the library had closed, she set up a new display case in the front foyer. She placed Nathaniel's book at the center, beside a new sign. Featured author, once a reader here, now a voice for thousands. The next morning, the first patron through the door asked where they could find a copy, and then another, and another. By the end of the week, the library had reordered 3 more boxes. Helen never said it out loud, but every time she passed the display, she whispered a quiet thank you to the quiet boy who used to sit in the back, because sometimes the stories worth saving aren't written by the loudest voices. They're written by the ones who sat in the shadows, who listened, who endured. and who one day found the courage to speak. And the world, at last, listened back. A year had passed since Helen had first seen Nathaniel curled over his battered notebook in the back corner of the library. In that year, so many things had changed, and yet so much of the library remained the same. The creaky radiator still clanked on cold nights. The scent of paper and lemony floor polish still filled the air, and Helen still took her breaks precisely at 7:15, sipping chamomile tea while watching the rhythm of life move quietly between the stacks. But now she was watching something else too: growth. The kind you didn't always see in inches or letter grades, the kind that came in the form of returned smiles, of people standing a little taller, of voices no longer afraid to echo. Nathaniel's story had left ripples in that space long after he stopped showing up every evening. His book sat on the shelf with a small label: local author. His name had been added to the community reading list, and teenagers who once wandered aimlessly between graphic novels now asked where they could find books like Nathaniel's. Then, one Friday afternoon, just before closing, a group of students filed into the library, 5th or 6th graders by the look of them, all laughter and backpacks and shoes that squeaked on the tile. At their lead was a young teacher with energy in her stride and a stack of papers in her arms. "We're looking for Ms. Helen," she called across the front desk. Helen stood, brushing cookie crumbs off her lap. "You found her." The woman smiled brightly. "Ms. Helen, I'm Emily. I'm teaching a creative writing workshop at Northview Middle. One of my students, Lucas, insisted we come here, said he had to show us the place where it all started." She turned and gestured toward the smallest boy in the group, a thin, wide-eyed kid with a buzz cut and sneakers that lit up when he moved. He stepped forward, shy but glowing. "I read Nathaniel's book 3 times, he said, clutching a dog-eared copy. "I want to be like him. I want to write something that matters." Helen blinked away the sting behind her eyes. "You already are," she said softly. Lucas grinned and pulled a stapled packet from his backpack. "I wrote my first story. It's about a kid who turns invisible unless someone says his name." Helen took the story with both hands, the way she might hold a rare artifact. "I'd love to read it." The other students chimed in too, some shyly, others bursting with energy. They talked about their ideas, about the worlds they wanted to build, about how writing made them feel like they weren't so small. And as they settled in at the long table by the windows, where Nathaniel once sat alone, Helen realized something profound. This wasn't just about one boy anymore. It was about every child who'd ever felt unseen, every teen who didn't know where to go after school, every lost soul who wandered through the doors of that old brick building searching for something they couldn't name. Nathaniel had started a fire with his words, and now that fire had found kindling in dozens of others. That weekend, Helen pulled out a dusty binder from the staff archives and started a new section, Young Authors of Summit Ridge Library. Inside went Lucas's story. Then 2 more the following week. Then 10 by the end of the month. It became a movement without anyone naming it. Parents began asking for writing nights. Teachers coordinated field trips. The city printed posters that read, "Every voice has a page. Every page has a home." And one night, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast golden bars of light through the window panes, a now older Nathaniel walked back through the doors. He was taller, his frame more filled out, wearing a second-hand suit jacket over a collared shirt. Still quiet, but not hidden. He carried a duffel bag and a box. Helen looked up from the desk, startled into a smile. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he grinned. "Got a second book," he said, tapping the box. "And a question." She raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I want to start a mentorship program for kids who write. For kids like, you know." "I do know." He nodded toward the reading tables filled with middle schoolers scribbling in spiral notebooks, laughing, reading each other's stories. "You already started it," he said softly. She stood and stepped around the desk. "Come on," she said. Let's shelve your new book." They walked side by side to the shelf marked Local Authors. Helen pulled the first copy of his new title from the box and slid it onto the shelf with practiced grace. Letters from the Window Seat by Nathaniel J. Miller. The cover was simple. A boy staring out a rain-speckled bus window, his reflection half faded, half formed. "I wrote it for the ones who never found a Helen," he said. She turned to him, touched but steady. "Then let's make sure no one has to go without again." He opened his duffel and pulled out a stack of forms, flyers, contact sheets, everything for the mentorship program. And then, with a slow smile, he opened the flap of his new backpack and took out something familiar, the old composition notebook, weathered, soft-spined, edges taped, and pages still clinging to life. "I kept it," he said, "because I wanted to remember how far a person can go with nothing but a pencil and someone who believes in them." Helen placed her hand gently over his. "You gave the rest of us something too," she said. "Proof that hope can come back even when you think it's left for good." That night, long after the lights dimmed and the building fell quiet, Helen sat alone in her chair, Nathaniel's new book on her lap. She looked around at the library, at the shelves filled with thousands of lives, real and imagined. And then, finally, at the third-row table where it had all begun. No one sat there anymore, but somehow that corner never felt empty again. Because it had become something more than furniture. It had become sacred. It had become story. Nathaniel's mentorship program didn't explode overnight. It didn't trend on social media or land a flashy article in a national magazine. But like everything Nathaniel touched, it grew quietly, meaningfully, and with roots deeper than anyone realized. The first two mentees were siblings, Marcos and Lila, who came to the library every Tuesday and Thursday after school. Their aunt worked double shifts at the diner across the street, and the library had always been their unofficial babysitter. Now, with Nathaniel meeting them at a side table near the mystery section, it became something more. Marcos had a flair for wild adventure stories with talking animals and time machines cobbled together from soda cans. Lila, on the other hand, wrote about silence, about long hallways and mothers who didn't come home, about girls who learned to listen to the wind because it was the only thing that spoke back. Nathaniel never edited their words harshly. He didn't line through sentences or circle grammatical mistakes. He read with the reverence of someone being trusted with sacred things. And when they asked questions, what's a metaphor? How do you end a story? He didn't give lectures. He told them about how he had once hidden between bookshelves and how the first time someone called his writing important, he'd almost cried in the stairwell because no one had ever called him important before. Within 2 months, there were 6 mentees, then 12. By spring, the library had converted one of the old storage rooms into the writer's room, complete with beanbags, whiteboards, and a shelf full of donated journals and pens. Helen found grants to help fund snacks and transportation stipends. Local authors offered to visit. Even the city council took notice, proposing a small scholarship tied to the program's submissions. And Nathaniel? He kept showing up, week after week, always with that calm presence. The one that didn't demand attention, but somehow commanded it anyway. He was never flashy. He never read from his own books, or mentioned his past unless someone asked. But the younger kids followed him like gravity. Then one evening, as the writer's room buzzed with quiet voices and the scratching of pens, Helen called Nathaniel aside. "I need your help with something," she said, pulling a folded letter from her bag. He took it, eyes scanning the words slowly. It was an invitation from the State Librarian's Board, a keynote speech for their annual conference. Topic: Literacy, Legacy, and Libraries. Nathaniel stared at the signature at the bottom. They want me. They want the boy who turned a quiet corner into a movement. He looked up, uncertain. "I'm not good at speeches." Helen smiled. You're not giving a speech. You're telling your story. And so a month later, he stood in front of 300 people in a downtown auditorium, hands shaking behind the podium. He'd worn the suit again, the same one from the day he introduced his mother, and clutched the same composition notebook that had never left his side. "I used to come to the library every night," he began, voice unsteady but growing. "Not because I loved books, not at first, but because it was warm and quiet, and no one asked questions." He told them about the backpack, about the notebook, about Helen. "I wasn't just a kid looking for a place to sit. I was looking for a place to matter." The room stilled. "I didn't need a rescue. I needed a witness, and I got one." By the time he stepped down from the stage, the applause was on its feet. Not because he was eloquent, not because he had the charisma of a polished speaker, but because everything he said rang with the kind of truth you couldn't fabricate. Afterward, a woman approached him, tears in her eyes. "My son doesn't talk much," she said. "He's in 8th grade, writes in journals but won't show them to anyone. I think you just gave him a reason to try." Nathaniel nodded, accepting the contact info she handed him. He returned home with his second notebook nearly full, this one with observations, memories, lines of dialogue he'd overheard at the conference. He told Helen he thought he might write something new, something that mixed fiction and truth. A novel, maybe, about a boy who lived in a library but learned to live beyond it. "I think the story's still unfolding," he said. Helen grinned. "The best ones always are." And still, the ripple spread. One day, a package arrived at the library. Inside was a hardcover copy of Between Shelves and Silence, wrapped in tissue paper and bound in gold ribbon. It was signed not by Nathaniel this time, but by a publishing house. "Special edition," the note read, "used in 5 literacy curriculums, dozens more to come." Helen placed it beside the original in the display case. She no longer needed to dust it every Tuesday. Now children volunteered to do it. And then, one golden evening, just as summer crept in and the air was filled with the scent of sun-warmed books and honeysuckle from the courtyard, Nathaniel stood in front of the library's front steps with a plaque in his hands. It read, "In honor of Helen B. Hartwell, for seeing what others overlooked, and for believing in every quiet voice. Established by the Writers' Circle of Summit Ridge." Helen tried to protest. "You don't put up plaques for people who just do their job." But Nathaniel only shook his head. "You didn't just do your job, you saw me when no one else did." She looked down at the plaque, then up at the children filing in behind him. Dozens now, bright-eyed, noisy, alive. And she understood. The plaque wasn't for her. It was for every forgotten child who had once wandered into the library and found not just books, but belonging. That night, after the lights dimmed and the last story circle ended, Helen sat once more at her desk. She opened her own old journal, the one with pages that had yellowed long before Nathaniel ever walked through the door, and she wrote a single sentence. The boy with the backpack never left. Because even now, even in his absence, his presence lingered. In the notebooks piled high on student desks, in the soft laughter echoing between shelves, in the silence that now felt sacred, not empty. Nathaniel J. Miller had come to the library in search of nothing more than a warm place to sit. But what he left behind was a legacy. And somewhere, maybe across town, maybe across the country, a child was picking up a pencil for the first time. Because someone told them, "Your story matters, write it." And so they did. 3 years after the mentorship program began, the Summit Ridge Library had transformed into more than just a place to borrow books. It had become a pulse point, a quiet but powerful heartbeat in the center of the community. The walls that once echoed with hushed whispers and the occasional shuffle of pages now hummed with creativity. Teenagers spilled across beanbags with notebooks in their laps. Adults came to workshops held in the evenings, reading aloud poetry they never thought they'd show anyone. Veterans met with high schoolers to co-author memory journals. And in the middle of it all stood Nathaniel. He was older now, just past 18, though he carried himself with a steadiness few his age ever learned. He still wore the suit jacket when he taught classes, still used the same mechanical pencil with the faded grip, and still kept the old composition notebook in his bag like a relic, its pages now protected by a hand-sewn cover stitched by one of his students. And yet, despite everything he had become, a published author, a mentor, a speaker, he never referred to himself as anything more than a student of stories. It was what he told every kid who joined the writer's circle. He'd say, "We're all students here, we just have different chapters." One autumn afternoon, Helen received a letter in a pale cream envelope with a wax seal, formal, elegant, and clearly important. Inside, written in careful script, was an invitation from the National Literacy Alliance. Nathaniel J. Miller had been nominated for the Youth Impact Medal, awarded once every 5 years to a young person who had changed the trajectory of literacy in their community. He was to be honored at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., and the letter included a +1. Helen had never flown in her life. She hadn't stepped out of her city in nearly 2 decades. But when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway of her office, holding up the letter with both hands and grinning like a boy again, she knew she was going. They flew out in late October, Nathaniel in a tailored navy blue suit borrowed from a friend at the community center, and Helen in a soft gray pantsuit she'd secretly saved for something she couldn't name until now. The ceremony was held in a hall of soaring ceilings and polished marble, with authors, educators, and philanthropists seated at round tables dressed in white linen. When Nathaniel's name was called, the applause was instant. He walked to the stage with his familiar, unhurried stride, head high, eyes calm. He didn't carry notes, didn't need them. "I was never supposed to be here," he began, voice steady across the quiet auditorium. 3 years ago, I was the kid sitting in the back of a library trying not to be noticed. I wasn't reading for pleasure, I was reading to feel human." Gasps rippled softly through the room. There was no one waiting for me at home. No one texting to ask where I was. I had a backpack, a pencil, and a librarian who didn't flinch when I needed help. He paused, gaze sweeping the audience. Everything I have now, every book, every speech, every student, it started because one person believed I was worth listening to, not because I had potential, but because I had pain, and she didn't turn away from it. He gestured to Helen in the front row. She changed the direction of my life by doing something simple. She stayed. And then she handed me the tools to tell my own story. He raised the medal he had just been given, fingers brushing the embossed inscription. "This doesn't belong to me," he said. "It belongs to every kid still hiding in a library. Every teacher who sneaks food into their desk drawer just in case. Every writer who's been told their story doesn't matter. We see you, you matter. And your voice is waiting." The standing ovation was instant, but Helen didn't stand. She sat perfectly still, tears rolling down her cheeks, hands clasped over her chest, overwhelmed not by the honor, but by the journey. The next day, when they returned to Summit Ridge, a small crowd had gathered outside the library. Students, parents, staff, and strangers who had followed the story online. Someone had printed a banner. "Welcome home, Nathaniel. Our stories are stronger because of you." And right beneath it, a little boy handed him a fresh composition notebook. "It's for your next book," he said shyly. Nathaniel crouched down and accepted it with both hands. "What should I write about?" The boy shrugged. "Maybe about someone who never gave up." Nathaniel smiled. "Then I'll need to start with you." That night Helen stayed late. She walked the aisles like she always had, touching spines, flipping through titles, pausing to reshelve a crooked copy of The Outsiders. But when she passed the third-row table, she stopped. Something was different. There, taped carefully to the underside of the reading lamp, was a note in Nathaniel's handwriting. For the next kid who needs this seat, may your story begin here. Helen stood still for a long time. Then she walked to the front desk and turned off the overhead light. But she left the lamp on, just in case. Winter arrived early that year, casting a soft hush over Summit Ridge as the first snow blanketed the streets before Thanksgiving. The library windows frosted at the corners, and the radiators clanked with renewed purpose, sending waves of warmth through the quiet rooms. Outside, the city slowed. Inside, stories moved as they always had, gentle, steady, and resilient. Nathaniel's program, now formally named Voices Between the Stacks, had grown larger than he'd ever imagined. What began with 3 or 4 students after school had evolved into a full-blown youth literacy initiative. Local schools had partnered with the library. Universities had offered internships for writing students to serve as mentors. And Helen, still proudly cataloging books and rearranging displays, had unofficially become the program's soul. On a Friday afternoon, as the sun hung low behind heavy clouds, Nathaniel arrived early. He carried 3 things with him: a thermos of coffee, a stack of freshly printed submission packets, and a letter. He walked through the front doors just as Helen was finishing the last of the week's returns. "Got something for you," he said, holding out the envelope. She raised a brow and took it, unfolding the thick cream paper slowly. Her eyes scanned the letter once, then again. "You're applying to teach?" He nodded. "Part-time? Community college. Just a workshop on narrative nonfiction. But they said they'd waive the degree requirement because of the books. Because of the work we've done." Helen held the letter tighter. "You should have led with that. I wanted to tell you here, at the desk." She smiled, remembering the boy who had once stood here, unsure if he even deserved to be noticed. "You'll be brilliant." He glanced toward the writer's room, where laughter echoed off the walls. "I wouldn't be doing it if it weren't for this place." "No," she said gently, "you'd still be doing it, but maybe not quite this way." That evening, as students filled the room with stories, some scribbled, others typed, a few shared aloud, Nathaniel stepped into the middle of the circle and sat cross-legged among them. He listened as a girl named Soraya read a poem about her grandmother's missing wedding ring. Then a boy named Eli shared a short story about a robot who wrote letters to its future self. Each voice carried its own cadence, its own scars, and its own kind of light. When it was his turn, Nathaniel didn't read anything. He just spoke. "Writing isn't just about putting words on paper," he said. "It's about proof. Proof that you're still here, that you've seen things, felt things, and maybe that you've survived them." The students were quiet. "I used to think no one would care about what I wrote. I thought I had to be loud or angry or dramatic for people to listen. But it turns out the quiet truth, the stuff that lives in the corners, is what stays with people the longest." He looked around the circle, his voice low. "I used to sit in the back of this library because I didn't think I belonged anywhere else. But every one of you, every story you share, has turned this place into something more than shelves and books. You've made it a home." They clapped. Not loud, not showy, just a warm, full sound that filled the space with something deeper than noise. That night, after the students left and Helen locked the doors, Nathaniel lingered at the bench by the window. "Remember the first time I sat here?" he asked. She nodded. "You were soaked, cold, didn't speak for almost a week. I was so scared you'd ask me to leave." "I know, but you didn't." "I never could have," she whispered. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it and held it out to her, a brass plaque, engraved and polished. "Reading Room Bench, in honor of the ones who stayed. Donated by the first student who didn't leave." Helen took it carefully, fingers trembling. "Nathaniel, you said this place gave me a home," he said. but you were the first place that felt like one. They installed the plaque that weekend. By Monday, the bench had become more than furniture again. Students sat there with journals open on their knees. Visitors lingered there to read letters from past mentees, now kept in a memory binder beside the reading lamp, and sometimes newcomers would ask about the name etched into the brass. "Who was the first student?" they'd say, and someone, usually a peer, sometimes a librarian, would answer, "He was the boy with the backpack. He stayed, and then he taught the rest of us how to." Years passed. Nathaniel published his third book, a memoir this time. It hit bestseller lists not because it was flashy or controversial, but because it was real. Shelves, silence, and the spaces between became a staple in classrooms, libraries, shelters, and prisons. It was read by those who needed to remember that their voice mattered. Helen eventually retired, but she stayed on as a volunteer, leading story time for toddlers and cataloging book donations with the same precision she always had. On her last official day behind the front desk, Nathaniel surprised her with a ceremony. Nothing grand, just a gathering of students, staff, and patrons. They filled the main reading room with flowers, notes, and printed pages of stories she'd helped bring into the world. One by one, the kids stepped forward and read the opening lines of their first stories. Every single one began with the same dedication. For Helen. When the last student finished, Nathaniel stepped up and handed her a journal, a leather-bound volume, crisp and empty. "What's this?" she asked. "Your turn," he said, smiling. "Time to tell your story." Helen opened the first page. Inside, already written in soft pencil, were the words, "Once there was a woman who saw the quiet ones, and stayed long enough for them to speak." She closed the book and held it to her chest. The library stayed open late that night. No one seemed in a hurry to leave. The reading lamp glowed. The bench was full, and somewhere near the back, a new kid sat down for the first time, backpack slumped at his feet, eyes darting around the room. A librarian approached slowly, gently. "Stay as long as you like," she said. And the story began again. It was a spring morning, quiet, golden, the kind that made everything feel possible, when Nathaniel received the letter that would, once again, change his life. He found it tucked between two donation envelopes at the library front desk, where he still helped Helen's successor, a bright young librarian named Miss Janine, sort the morning mail. The envelope was thin, unremarkable, bearing the return address of a university Nathaniel had only ever dreamed of attending, Emerson. He opened it slowly, carefully, and read the words once, then twice. "Congratulations." He sat down without meaning to, the bench behind him catching his knees. A full scholarship, creative writing, 4 years. When Miss Janine asked what the letter was about, he just held it up with shaking hands and whispered, "They want me." It didn't feel real. Even as the community threw a celebration in his honor, even as his mentees created handmade cards and filled a wall of the writer's room with quotes from his stories, even as Helen cried when he gave her a framed copy of the letter inscribed with, "For the woman who opened the first door." It still didn't feel real. It wasn't until the day he stood in front of the mirror in a campus dorm room, suitcase unpacked, notebooks stacked on the desk, bookshelves already half filled with worn favorites, that it finally hit him. He had done it, not escaped, not run, not stumbled into someone else's dream, but built something. Carved it with words, stacked it with sentences, carried it in his backpack for years until someone finally looked and said, "That matters." And now he was here. The first days were quiet. He attended his lectures, sat near the back, listened more than he spoke. His professors knew his name. His books had reached some of their shelves, but Nathaniel didn't lead with that. He was content to be a student again, to learn, to grow. But every night when the dorm hall settled and voices faded, he pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote. Not always stories, sometimes letters, sometimes memories, often reflections. One night he wrote, "I used to think the world was shaped like a library, quiet, cold, filled with people who never looked up. But now I think it's more like a story circle, open, waiting, everyone holding the pen at some point. And then, sometimes you have to write your way home before you realize you've been building one all along. Word spread quietly on campus. A few underclassmen asked if he'd read their work. Then a professor suggested he lead a peer writing group. By mid-semester, he was back where he thrived, sitting on a floor, notebook in hand, surrounded by young writers who didn't yet know how much their stories would matter. One evening, as a warm breeze crept in through the windows of the writing commons, Nathaniel pulled out something from his backpack. Not a laptop or a textbook, but the old battered composition notebook, the original. He set it on the table and opened it to a random page. A passage from when he was 13, scribbled, uncertain, raw. Today I sat in the library for 4 hours and no one told me to leave. I think that means something. I don't know what yet. He smiled. Then he copied those words onto the whiteboard and added beneath them, it meant everything. When graduation finally came 4 years later, Nathaniel stood at the podium once more, this time as valedictorian of the Creative Arts College. He wore a pin in the shape of a book on his gown. In the crowd sat Helen, a little older now, but no less radiant. She waved when he looked down at her, and he nodded, holding her gaze as he began. My story began in a library, he said. Not because I loved to read, but because it was the only place I felt safe. There, surrounded by other people's words, I began to find my own. He paused. And someone saw me. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with a story. He looked at Helen, and she smiled through her tears. That made all the difference. After the ceremony, as the crowd spilled out into the courtyard, Nathaniel was approached by a small boy in a pressed shirt, clinging to the hand of a woman in a staff lanyard. The boy reached into his backpack and pulled out a journal. I read your book, he said, barely a whisper. I brought this in case you wanted to read mine. Nathaniel took the journal gently, holding it like it was something sacred. I'd be honored, he said. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the lawn, he flipped to the first page. Once there was a boy who sat in a library every night until someone saw his backpack. Nathaniel looked up and smiled. The story would never truly end, because every time someone chose to listen, every time a quiet kid picked up a pencil, every time a door opened instead of closing, the story would begin again. Years passed, but Summit Ridge Library never lost its pulse, not in the way that truly mattered. The walls might have been repainted, the carpets replaced, the shelves expanded to make room for new donations and rotating collections, but the air still held that same quiet reverence, still hummed with the breath of stories not yet written. In a sunlit corner, where the reading lamp glowed like an old friend, and the brass plaque still bore Nathaniel's name, children sat cross-legged in a circle on Wednesday afternoons. The writer's circle had become tradition, an institution, no longer a pilot program or a community experiment, but a living, breathing legacy. Nathaniel, though no longer a boy, returned often. Between book tours, teaching semesters, and speaking engagements, he always carved out time for the place that started it all. Sometimes he came quietly, slipping through the doors unnoticed and browsing the stacks just to feel the weight of home again. Other times, he came for workshops, mentoring, guiding. And one day he came with someone else, a girl, 8 years old, with glasses that slipped down her nose and a shoelace untied on her left sneaker. Her name was Ellie. She was quiet like he had been, clutching a worn purple notebook to her chest like it might fly away. Helen, now fully retired but often volunteering, looked up from the returns desk and smiled. She looks familiar. Nathaniel chuckled softly. She should. She's my niece. Didn't know you had one. He bent slightly, tousled Ellie's hair. Didn't know either, until her mom reached out. Long story, but she likes to write. Ellie's eyes darted around the room, wide with curiosity, cautious with wonder. She didn't speak, but she stepped forward and touched the edge of the bench beneath the reading lamp. Nathaniel knelt beside her. "This is the place," he whispered, "where it all began." Her fingers brushed the brass plaque. "Was this really yours?" He nodded. "It was once, but now it belongs to everyone who needs it." Ellie slid onto the bench, pulled out her notebook, and flipped to a page filled with tiny, looping letters. She didn't ask for help. She just started writing. "And Nathaniel?" He sat beside her, silent, still, watching her like Helen had once watched him. Outside, the seasons shifted, spring giving way to the first slow heat of summer. Inside, stories grew, took root, bloomed. In the display case near the entrance, beneath Nathaniel's books and student anthologies, a new card had been added. Every voice matters, every story counts, and someone somewhere is always listening. NJM. And near the checkout desk, a staff bulletin board now held a single framed photograph. A grainy black-and-white image of a boy sitting alone at a table, his backpack slumped beside him, his head bent over a notebook. Above it, a handwritten caption, "He stayed, and so did we." That night, long after closing, Ellie slipped her purple notebook onto the desk where Helen had once worked. She didn't say anything, just left it open to the first page, where 3 words had been carefully written. "Thank you, Nathaniel." He read the page, gently closed the cover, and placed the notebook beside his own. Not behind it, not beneath it, beside it. Because the story didn't end with him. It never had. It only ever began, again and again and again. The 10th anniversary of the Writers' Circle at Summit Ridge Library arrived without fanfare. There were no balloons, no cake, no announcements plastered across the windows. Instead, the celebration unfolded in the quietest and most fitting of ways, with stories. That afternoon, the reading room filled with familiar faces. Some were still students, bright-eyed, shy, scribbling in their journals like they were holding something fragile and powerful at once. Others were now young adults, returned from college or jobs, or long stretches of figuring themselves out. They came with manuscripts, laptops, and dog-eared copies of their own self-published zines. Some even carried books with their names on the covers. Nathaniel stood at the center of it all. His hair was longer now, streaked slightly with early gray that gave him a certain kind of gravity. He wore his usual plain shirt, soft jacket, a pen clipped to his collar. He had just returned from a global speaking tour, schools, shelters, detention centers, any place where silence lived too long. He hadn't planned to say much, but as the crowd gathered in the glow of the third-row reading lamp, he stepped forward, voice low and even. 10 years ago, he began, I sat right over there with a backpack I didn't want anyone to notice. I was tired, hungry, and I didn't know if I'd make it through the week. The room listened. I didn't come to write stories, he continued. I came because I didn't know where else to go, but someone looked at me, really looked, and saw something worth staying for. He turned, met Helen's eyes from across the room. She nodded, seated quietly in the back row, her lap covered by a blanket and her hands folded over her cane. She didn't try to save me, he said, and she just didn't look away. Silence followed, the kind that filled more than space, the kind that carried memory. Over the years, I've spoken at halls and conferences in front of thousands, Nathaniel said. But this room, these pages, this is where the change happened. Not out there, right here, with you, with your voices. He reached into his backpack, newer now, but still marked with a few threads of fray, and pulled out a stack of notebooks, some full, some barely started. I want to give you something, he said. Not advice, not instruction, but something simple. He handed a notebook to the nearest student. Your words matter, even the ones that scare you, especially those. The student took the notebook like a gift. Around the circle, others leaned in, drawn by more than just his voice, drawn by the weight of his presence, his proof, his lived truth. Helen, from her chair, opened a copy of Nathaniel's first book. She read the dedication again. To the librarian who didn't need to know everything before she cared. Later, as dusk painted the windows gold and the lights inside the library flickered on, Helen tapped her cane and rose slowly. The room turned to her without needing to be asked. "I've been a keeper of stories for over 40 years, she said, voice cracked but clear. And in all that time, I've only met a handful of stories that changed the course of others." She looked to Nathaniel. "Yours was one." She looked to the students. "Yours will be next." Then, as if moved by something older than ceremony, the students stood one by one. Each came forward. Each handed Helen or Nathaniel a slip of paper, a poem, a folded letter. One even handed over a flash drive wrapped in ribbon. "This is mine," each of them said. "My story." Nathaniel collected them all, placed them gently in a wooden box with the label Voices of Summit Ridge, Volume 1. It would become an anthology by year's end. Later, when the last student left and the lights dimmed, Nathaniel stood alone in the reading room. The lamp still glowed softly. The bench still bore the plaque. He sat down, opening his journal. Today the circle returned to where it started, but it didn't close. It widened. He closed the book, stood, and walked to the glass doors. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall. He paused, then reached back into his backpack and pulled out a thin paperback, Ellie's first book, published just a month before. He placed it on the display shelf beside his own, and beneath it, a new note. She sat on the bench where her uncle once wrote the first line of the rest of his life, and the story began again. Then he stepped into the snowfall. No destination, just forward, because stories don't end. Not when they're lived. Summer arrived the way it always did in Summit Ridge, slow, warm, and unhurried. The trees outside the library rustled with thick green leaves. Children chased fireflies in the early evenings, and the scent of old paper mingled with sun lotion and open windows. Inside the library, the legacy of the Writers' Circle had grown far beyond anything the original staff had envisioned. What started as an act of compassion, a seat left open, a lamp left on, had become a movement woven into the identity of the town itself. Teachers mentioned it during classroom orientations. Local businesses donated notebooks and pens to the Circle's supply closet. Parents whispered about the waiting list for younger students hoping to join once they were old enough. And now, the building itself bore witness. Near the entrance, a bronze sculpture had been installed just that spring. It showed a boy seated at a bench, head bowed over an open notebook, backpack at his side. Simple, understated, real. The plaque read, "He sat in the library every night until closing. Now the library stays open because of him." Tourists stopped to take photos. Former students ran their hands along the sculpture's edge. Some left notes tucked between the pages of the bronze notebook. Others just stood still, quiet for a moment, as if honoring a grave. But it wasn't a place of sadness. It was a place of memory, of reclamation. That August, the library hosted its first annual Narrative Week, a festival of storytelling, workshops, author talks, and reading marathons. And headlining the event, as always, was Nathaniel. He had just returned from 3 weeks overseas, visiting refugee camps with an NGO dedicated to literacy access. He looked older now, not tired, but worn in the way pages grow softer with rereading. His voice was slower, his gaze more distant. But his words, those were sharper than ever. On the first night of Narrative Week, Nathaniel took the stage beneath a canopy of twinkle lights and read aloud from a new manuscript. The crowd stretched across the lawn, cross-legged on blankets, notebooks in laps, some holding candles, others phones recording every word. "I used to think storytelling was survival," he said, "but now I think it's inheritance. We leave behind something for the next person. Not gold, not buildings, but truth." He paused. "I didn't write to be remembered. I wrote to stay alive, but it turns out that's how remembering begins." The audience was silent. Some wept openly. Others pressed their fingers over their hearts. Helen, seated near the front, her hair now white and her cane resting against her chair, nodded slowly. After the reading, Nathaniel stepped down and made his way through the crowd. Students surrounded him. Teachers hugged him. Strangers thanked him. But he didn't linger too long in the attention. Instead, he slipped away to the sculpture near the front steps. There, seated in its shadow, was a new child, maybe 11, maybe younger, clutching a canvas bag and a legal pad filled with scribbles. The child looked up, startled. "Are you him?" Nathaniel smiled gently. "I'm one of them." The child's brow furrowed. "One of who?" "The quiet ones. The ones who stayed until someone listened." The child blinked, then looked down. "They said I could join the writing group in September, that it's full now." Nathaniel nodded. "It is." The child looked away, disappointed. "But that doesn't mean you can't start," he added. "Want to sit inside for a bit? The bench is still warm." The child's eyes lit up, surprised. Together they entered the library. Nathaniel held the door open, waited as the child shuffled nervously inside. He led them toward the reading lamp. Nothing had changed there. Same table, same glow, same quiet. The child sat. Nathaniel handed them a fresh pen from his jacket pocket, and the child began to write. A few minutes later, Miss Janine passed by and smiled, setting a small carton of apple juice and a granola bar on the corner of the table. The ritual hadn't faded. Later that evening, as narrative week wrapped for the night, Helen stood beside Nathaniel at the front desk. "Still feels like magic," she whispered. "It is," he said. "You know," she added, eyes scanning the shelves, "when I started here, I thought the most important thing I'd ever do was keep books from falling apart. You did more than that. You helped people not fall apart." She smiled, eyes damp. "And you helped them rebuild." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin envelope. "What's this?" "My will," he said quietly. "I'm leaving the rights to all my books, my royalties, and the manuscript vault to the library." Helen's eyes widened. "Nathaniel!" "It belongs here. I don't want the words in some glass building in a city that doesn't know how they were born. I want them where they were whispered into life, where someone like me might find them." She opened the envelope slowly, reading the lines. Her hand trembled as she tucked it into her chest. "I never thought a quiet boy in a soaked hoodie would change the whole world." "He didn't," Nathaniel said, smiling faintly. "He just reminded the world that quiet boys matter." The lights dimmed, the chairs emptied, the streets hushed. But inside, beneath the reading lamp, a new voice scribbled its first paragraph, and somewhere across town, someone else paused at their own desk, thinking of a memory too loud to ignore. They reached for a pen. The story began again. Fall crept into Summit Ridge with golden leaves, gentle winds, and that unmistakable hush that settled over the world just before dusk. The mornings turned brisk. The afternoons held that strange in-between light. And at the library, the change of season meant more than pumpkin-themed bookmarks and sweatered patrons. It meant the beginning of something sacred. The 11th year of the Writers' Circle. Nathaniel returned just in time. He'd been away for most of the summer, finishing his 4th book, a memoir told in fragments and letters, woven with prose from the thousands of submissions he'd received over the years. The title was simple, To the Ones Who Stayed. It had already won 2 national awards. He hadn't come back for accolades, though. He returned because the seasons weren't right without the library. Without that soft hum of HVAC, the sharp scent of old paper and new possibility, the chair by the lamp that had molded to his shape over the years. Without the kids, messy, brilliant, aching to be heard. He returned for Ellie, too. Now a teenager, Ellie had grown into her voice. Her second book, The Window Girl, was in its second printing. She still chewed on her pen caps and talked too fast when she was excited, but her confidence had settled in her shoulders. She no longer hunched like she was hiding her brilliance. She walked like a writer. That first Monday back, Nathaniel entered the library as he always did, quietly, just before closing. Miss Janine met him with a smile, a folder, and a hug. "Applications for the new cohort," she said, handing him the stack. "How many?" 43? Nathaniel's brow lifted. "We only have 12 spots." She grinned. "You're going to have a hard time saying no." He took the folder and sat beneath the lamp, just like always. But that night, something was different. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were 6 worn envelopes, each marked with a name, each one sealed with red wax. He placed them on the table. Ellie appeared beside him, drawn by the weight of the moment. "What are those?" "Letters," he said, "to the kids who never came back." She blinked. "You kept them?" "I couldn't not." They sat together and read the names. Some were students who had only come for 1 or 2 sessions. Others had been regulars, then disappeared, to other cities, other lives. A few, they knew, hadn't made it past the hard parts. "These were the ones I couldn't reach," he said. "So I wrote to them, just in case they ever came back." Ellie was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Maybe it's time we send them anyway." Nathaniel looked at her. "How?" "Maybe not with stamps," she said. "Maybe through stories. Maybe we put their names in the dedications. Maybe we write them as characters. Maybe we whisper them into the corners of pages where they'll be safe." He nodded slowly. "I like that." The next day, Nathaniel stood before the new cohort. 12 students sat in a loose circle, some gripping pencils, others holding tablets or sketch pads. One wore earbuds, eyes darting, hands trembling. He didn't begin with rules or goals. He began with a story. He told them about a boy who used to hide behind the tall shelves, about a librarian who didn't ask questions but left snacks and space, about a reading lamp that always stayed on until the last person left, about how words weren't always loud, sometimes they came like whispers, and that was still enough. He told them, "This isn't school, this isn't therapy, this is a place where you bring what you have, no matter how messy, how strange, how unfinished, and we help each other make sense of it." Then he passed around the notebooks. Each one had a nameplate that read, "Writer's Circle, Summit Ridge Library, property of the voice who holds it," and below it, "Your story matters. We are already listening." After the session, Nathaniel sat with Helen beneath the old sycamore tree out front. She came in less often now, her health delicate, but her mind still sharp as ever. "They're a good group," she said. "The best yet." "Funny how the best yet keeps happening," he smiled. "Maybe that's what it means to build something lasting." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know this can't just be about you anymore." He nodded. "I know." "Then what's next?" He looked toward the library. "I think I need to train someone to take over the circle." She raised an eyebrow. "You already have." He turned. Ellie was standing at the door, watching the last of the kids walk out, answering questions, nodding, smiling the way he used to. "She's ready," Helen said. "She is," he whispered. That night, Nathaniel took down the display case by the entrance. Not all of it, just one row. In its place, he added a new section, Past Circle Leaders. Helen's name was first, then his, then a third spot left blank with a small plaque, In Progress. Weeks later, at the end of another meeting, Ellie gathered her group in the reading room. Nathaniel sat at the edge of the circle, not leading, not even speaking, just watching. Ellie cleared her throat. "I want to start a new tradition," she said. She held up a candle, just a small LED votive. "This light stays on, even when we're gone, because someone out there needs to know that we were here, that we made room, that we left the door open." She set the candle in the center of the circle, and everyone wrote. And somewhere, tucked into a corner of a shelf, a letter written years ago slipped loose from its envelope and drifted to the floor. Nathaniel picked it up. The name on the front was faded, but the words inside were not. "If you ever return, know this. You were loved even when you didn't know how to stay." He folded it gently and slid it into a new notebook. Then he placed it beneath the lamp. The bench was still warm.